Good morning. I'm Stephen Leake. I'm an elder at First Presbyterian Church of Mesquite, and I'm also the teacher of the Discipleship Sunday School class there. Today we're continuing with our study of the Gospel of John. And as a reminder, we're using as a study guide the Daily Bible Study Series by Professor William Barclay. Also, the scripture texts are taken from the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. Now, we're continuing with the story that's commonly called the cleansing of the temple. And I'm going to reread the scripture from last week's lesson and get us all caught up. John 2:12 through 16. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they remained there a few days. The Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." Now, in the last lesson on this scripture, we started discussing this story, what's commonly known as the cleansing of the temple. And we discussed last week the differences between John's Gospel and the Synoptic Gospels. And we got started on the story of, and the reasoning behind, Jesus objecting to the money changers and the commissions they were taking at the expense of the pilgrims. But besides the money changers, there were also the sellers of cattle and sheep and doves. A visit to the temple meant a sacrifice, as many pilgrims would want to make a thank offering for a favorable journey, and most events in life had a specific, appropriate sacrifice. So it might seem to be a natural and even a helpful thing that victims for the sacrifices could be purchased in the temple court. But the law was that any animal offered in sacrifice must be perfect and unblemished. The temple authorities had appointed inspectors to examine the victims which were to be offered, and a fee was charged for this service. But if a worshiper bought a victim outside the temple, it was certain to be rejected. That might not have mattered much, but a pair of doves could cost as much as 15 times more inside the temple than if it had been purchased outside the temple. Now, this was nothing less than extortion at the expense of the poor and humble pilgrims. They were practically blackmailed into buying their victims from temple booths if they wished to sacrifice. Once more, a glaring social injustice, aggravated by the fact that it was perpetuated in the name of religion. That too moved Jesus to flaming anger. We are told that he actually took cords and made a whip. The sight of Jesus angry and wielding a whip must have been a shocking thing to all those who knew him. But it was impossible for him to stand by passively while the worshipers were treated in this way. We've seen that it was the deliberate and shameless exploitation of the pilgrims which moved Jesus to wrath. But there were other reasons behind the cleansing of the temple. Let's see if we can uncover some of those reasons and why Jesus took this drastic step. No two of the gospel writers give Jesus' words in precisely the same way. They all have different versions. So we must put together all the versions to get a true picture of what Jesus said. Matthew 21:13 gives Jesus' words as, "My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you are making it a den of robbers." Mark 11:17 says, "My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a den of robbers." Luke 19:46 has it, "My house shall be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." And finally, our scripture in John 2:16 says, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." There were at least 3 reasons why Jesus acted as he did and why anger was in his heart. First, he acted as he did because God's house was being desecrated. In the temple, there was worship without reverence. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I'm an Eagle Scout, and I've been a Scout leader for many, many years. The 12th point of the Scout law is, a Scout is reverent. That means that we should respect the practices of our own and of others' religion. In our units, for example, if we have both Christian boys and Jewish boys, we'll have a worship service that does not mention Christianity. It'll be based just on the Old Testament. And likewise, if we're praying, the Protestant boys will often take off their hats, but the Jewish boys will pray with their hats on. And this creates a tolerance and a compassion for other people's religion. Worship without reverence is worship which does not recognize the holiness of God. It may be the use of the house of God for purposes and in a way where the true function of God's house is forgotten. Second, Jesus acted as he did in order to show the practice of animal sacrifice was completely irrelevant. For centuries, the prophets had been saying exactly that. In fact, one of Jesus' favorite Bible verses was Hosea 6:6. "For I desire steadfast love and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings." Now, it's the only verse that Jesus is recorded as quoting twice, in Matthew 9:13 and Matthew 12:17. And there were a number of other prophetic scriptures which urged an end to animal sacrifices. But animal sacrifices smoked continuously upon the altar at Jerusalem. Jesus acted as he did to show that no sacrifice of any animal could ever put a person right with God. Third, there's still another reason why Jesus acted as he did. Mark has a curious little addition which none of the other Gospels has. "My house shall be called the house of prayer for all the nations." Mark is the only one that puts it this way. The temple consisted of a series of courts into the temple proper and into the holy place. There was first the court of the Gentiles, then the court of women, then the court of the Israelites, then the court of the priests, and in the very center was the Holy of Holies. All this buying and selling was going on in the court of the Gentiles, and that was the only place into which a Gentile might come. Beyond that point, access to the Gentiles was barred. So if there was a Gentile whose heart God had touched, he might come into the court of the Gentiles to meditate and pray. The court of the Gentiles was their only option. The temple authorities and the Jewish traders were making the court of the Gentiles into a rabble where no man could pray. The noise of the animals and the traders made it impossible to worship there. The conduct in the temple court shut out the Gentile from the presence of God. That may be what was uppermost in Jesus' mind. Mark alone preserved that little phrase, and it means so much. Jesus was moved to the depths of his heart because those who were seeking God were being shut out from his presence. And we must be on guard for anything in our church life which keeps others out. A snobbishness, a coldness, an exclusiveness, a lack of welcoming, an arrogance, or anything which tends to make the congregation into a club creates barriers to those who would seek God in our midst. Let us remember the anger of Jesus against those who made it difficult and even impossible for the seeker to make contact with God. And let us create an atmosphere of welcoming reverence for all who wish to worship him. Thank you for your attention today. Next week we'll continue with our study of the book of John. God bless.